Today we're diving into the pool of data to understand why finding accurate data is critical to your ITAM success. With me today, Todd Hogan, our ITAM expert here at NCSI. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning, everyone.
We're taking a different approach today in this webinar series, more of a product agnostic, strategic view, so no products, tools, or demos today. The first series that you did is already on our YouTube channel. So, Todd, let's go ahead and discuss the 8 types of data that are keys to our success in asset management today.
All right. Thanks, John. Well, today, thanks for joining. We're going to be talking about asset management as a follow-on to our last session where we talked about, ITAM basics, some best practices, and we talked about why executives care about asset management. So today, I thought it would be nice to talk a little bit about what are the basic data elements that you need to build an asset management system. And as I started to prepare this, we have a document that we use that we give to our customers that kind of highlights the very specific data elements that you need. So I started down the path of creating a presentation, and I thought, let's just give our attendees that same document so it might be helpful for you. So I'm actually going to walk you through this document. It's a Word document, and John will send it out to you. It kind of identifies those key data elements that are part of ITAM best practice. And then we're going to drill down for the bulk of our discussion into what we call the foundation data. And that's the very most important data that you need to get your program up and running. So remember when we talked last week, a couple of weeks ago, asset management is a journey, and it takes several years. The experts will say it can be up to 3 years to go from just starting to fully mature. And that includes integration with all kinds of different systems. But what's really important as you start down this path is that you have good foundational data. So what we're going to talk about today, and we'll use this document, and then we'll share the document with you, what are those key data elements? So as you can see on the screen here, there is location data, organizational data, user data, vendor information, purchasing data, catalog data, contract data, discovery data. That's kind of the best practice part of that, of what represents good asset management data at a high level. But we're going to drill down today even one step lower because there's really kind of a process, and I apologize this isn't in PowerPoint format, but I think you'll find advantage as we move forward. So what we do here at NCSI is we realize that this is a journey, and we start out by working with our customers to do an assessment. We evaluate their environment, their resources. But what we're really going to focus on, as you'll notice here, is this first step called the foundation package. And before we can move on to more advanced topics, every one of our customers needs to make sure that they've got this foundational data in place. And so today, for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to drill into what are those foundational data elements that you need to prepare for in your environment to be able to roll out an effective asset management system. So you'll see here that this set is kind of a subset of that larger number, and we really boiled this down to just 4 or 5 key data elements. There's location data, organizational data, user data, the asset record data itself, and then of course we're going to leverage that against our discovery data like Avanti EPM or Microsoft SCCM. So let's start with location data and try and explain why we need these key pieces of information. Location data obviously tells us where the asset is. So we want to be able to use location data to know I've got this many assets in this location, this many in this location. It's critical for security, being able to pass back to your security officers and team to say, hey, this is where these assets are. It's essential for your inventory to be able to know what assets are in what location or what inventory facility are they located in. All of that is location data. And here in a second, we're going to drill down to a table that we'll provide you that actually we'll go kind of attribute by attribute. But right now, let's take an overview of these key data elements. The next data element is organizational data. And what we mean here is something like a cost center or a business unit. If you'll recall from our last discussion, we talked about how important it is to give our chief financial officer or our CIO the ability to run reports that say, this is all the assets that are allocated to marketing. These are all the assets that are allocated to sales. This is all the assets that are allocated to a particular hospital or a clinic. And we do that by assigning an organizational data element for example, like a business unit or cost center. Both location data and organizational data probably already exist in your environment in some form because other enterprise applications use that data. And in most cases, customers tend to use that same location and organizational data that exists for other systems because that's how you report up through your management chain on activities for IT spend, or other business processes. The next element that we're after is the user data. And oftentimes I get asked the question, do I just need the users that are managing the system in there, or do I need everyone? And the answer, of course, is you want everyone in the organization that has an asset to be in there, because what I want to do is I want to assign that asset to individual users. Again, extremely important when I'm running reports to roll up users by organization, or I want to be able to say, hey, this particular asset is being used by Bill, and this particular asset is being used by Nancy. It's important because I want to know that relationship between user, location, and asset for a multitude of reasons. One, my support desk people, when they're calling with a problem, they want to be able to log in and say, well, what assets does Nancy have? What does Tom have? And so knowing that user information is very important. And again, that user information can come from a variety of sources. So once we've gathered those are three core pieces of data that we need to be able to make the asset information effective. And then the next step is once we've got those in place, and remember, most of the tools you use, the asset management tool of your choice, is going to assume that all of those locations are predefined in the system, all the organizational data is predefined, all the users are predefined, because you just don't want to be able to just type in anybody's name, because there's no integrity in the system that way. That way, if somebody types in Tom and puts it in with THOM, and the next person types in TOM, and you're looking for assets that belong to Tom, you really don't have any idea. So most tools require that those elements of data are already in the system. And so as you're gathering this information, we'll talk about that in a second, which of these data elements are what we call relational, meaning that when you assign an asset record to a location, an organization, or user data, that record or that location, user, or cost center already exists in the system to be matched. The next thing we want to bring in is asset data. And as we talked about last time, remember, purchasing information is really the center of the universe in asset management. We oftentimes think that the center of the world is discovery data, like SCCM or EPM. But what really we're trying to get if we have it available to us, the best source of asset information is the acquisition information. Maybe we've got a download from one of our resellers, CDW or Insight, SHI, maybe directly from Lenovo, Dell, or HP. And that data tells us exactly the make, the model, the part number, the serial number. That's the perfect source of data as we try to bring this information in. That's where we want to first look for that data. Oftentimes, the reason you're building an asset management system is that you don't have good quality procurement data, so we need a substitute for that. And that's where we sometimes substitute good procurement data from our discovery data coming from SCCM or EPM, and oftentimes it doesn't have all the things we need, like the purchase cost or the purchase order number. We basically just know the make, the model, the part number, and a serial number. And so we can substitute in places where we don't have good data. And then the last element of this, what we call foundation data, is the discovery data itself. The discovery information when we go out and we've got an agent running out in our environment, like SCCM or EPM or BigFix or whatever you might be using in your environment. That's an agent out on the device, and sometimes it can be agentless, and it reports back whatever it finds on the internet environment. And so I can see what's out there, and I can report back and say, yes, that device is still there. Here's it gives me some configuration information. And what I want to do is I want to link that discovery data to that asset record, that procured asset record, and that's what we remember our discussion before. We want to make sure that we're leveraging discovery as a way of validating that that asset information is there. So those are what we would call the foundational data to get you started. So if you're right now thinking about building out an asset management program, there are many, many areas of the discipline of asset management. You can focus on contracts, you can focus on purchasing integration, you can focus on integration with your service management tool. All of those are extremely valuable. But before you go down those more advanced paths, we strongly encourage you here at NCSI, make sure you have these elements that we're talking about right here in place with good quality data. And if you do, you'll be able to move into those more advanced features and become successful. Your data will be integral, meaning that it's true. It's just not made up data, and you'll be able to be very successful as you progress down this path. So let's take a look now for a few minutes. If there's any questions.
Yeah, Chris has a question more on the tactical side of that data and how we get it and put it into the tool eventually. Does it come more on is it more CSV or like a data spreadsheet, or are there a lot of B2B connectors or APIs out there? What is the data looking like before you put it into the tool eventually?
That's a great question, because generally that data comes from a variety of different sources and oftentimes in a variety of different formats. But for the most part, most tools will support what we call a flat file structure, which is a CSV or an Excel type format. And then they have more advanced API connectors that will talk directly system to system to be able to pull those attributes in. I would strongly recommend that as you first start out where using that flat file structure to get your system populated, so you're not expending a great deal of energy trying to build one connector. Get the data in there, get it to a point where the data has integrity, and then as you mature, then work on those APIs to make it automated. But to answer more specifically the question, most tools will support even an Excel format. So you could take that data, kind of Excel is kind of the great common denominator, where we can take an export out of a system, put it in a CSV format, Excel opens it up into an Excel format, and then you can manipulate it, clean it up, and then digest it by the tool. So that's kind of how we would see most customers starting out, is through that flat file structure, later on moving to more advanced integration through API connections.
And I know we're not we're not talking about tools today, but are there tools out there that do have the hooks into Dell, HP, CDW, Insight to gather that information easily?
Yeah, there are connectors. A lot of different providers provide different connectors to different systems, and depending on the tool you're using, you may have something what we call out of the box, just immediately available to you. But in almost all of those cases, creating those connectors, most tools have a very easy format that allows you to consume that data without a great deal of effort. So you would generally find it quite easy to bring in any kind of flat file structure into your environment. So the answer is both in a lot of cases, but it depends on the data source. Okay, well let's take a look. I'm sure you kind of have questions about, we've talked about location data, organizational data, user data. Let's just look at this document, which highlights some of the common attributes that you might be looking for in each of these areas. And remember, different tools may name them differently. Different tools may use some attributes and some tools won't, but this is kind of a common list of the kinds of information that you might be looking at. And what I've done here is I've broken this down so that you can see in the left-hand column here the attribute name, a little description, and then is it a priority field? Is that something you really need to start out your asset management program? And I've put required, which means it's just mandatory, you have to have that. And then nice to have if it's something that you don't really, it's not essential, but it makes your data more meaningful. In the center of that, those three columns on the right, there's something called relational. And what that means is that that attribute is it has to be already exist inside of that asset system so that it can be consumed. So here's an example. Location, think of if I want to have my location has a hierarchy to it. So for example, let's say North America would be my first location that I would enter into the system. And then I want Salt Lake City, for example, where I'm located, to be a location. So now I have North America, Salt Lake City, and I'm thinking, well, I really don't want them to be in a flat structure. I want the parent to be North America to Salt Lake City. So you'll notice that in that case, if North America were going to be the parent of the hierarchy, then it has to already exist in the system. So if I were to, for example, let's say I create London, and I want to have London be part of the United Kingdom, but I haven't created the United Kingdom record. What would happen? Well, if the parent were United Kingdom, but I hadn't yet created it as a location itself, the system would go to look for the United Kingdom and say, there is no such thing. I can't make that relationship between the United Kingdom and London. So anywhere you see an X in our little discussion today, that's kind of a reminder that that type of attribute typically needs to reside in the system already in order for whatever you're importing to be able to go and find that and validate that that's a correct location of a correct user, a correct organization, something of that nature. And then when you look at the document, you'll see that we've got several phases, and I hate scrolling back up. John told me don't be scrolling back up and down. But here in the way we work with our customers, we have different phases. And so when you see the word foundation, that means that piece of information is one we really want to work on at the beginning. And maybe you'll see other phases that in our discussion down below here, which means that's coming at a later phase. I wouldn't really worry about that today because we're just not quite ready because we don't have our data in the right place yet. So let's look at location. Certainly we've got the location name, the parent if it's a hierarchy, an address, city, state, zip, country. Location's pretty straightforward. And again, we could pull this from an existing source that maybe you have in one of your other systems where you track location information. We could export that out of the system and import that into your asset management tool. The next thing on the list is we call it a financial owner or an organization like a business unit or a cost center. And remember, financial owner or organizational unit is really the organization where that asset is being consumed. And what I mean by that is this is where I want to run that report that says, hey, marketing is using all of these assets. Sales is using all of these assets. Very valuable as you're trying to provide information upstream for your team. But you'll notice there are a couple of other, maybe I want to include the manager of that organization so that I could run a report and say, hey, these are all the assets that are in your organization. Does this look right? So in order to put a manager in there, a manager is really a user, which means that before I could put a manager in for financial owner, I would have to have a user here. And that user would be, let's say it's John. John's my manager. John would have to exist in the system before he could be the manager of an organization. So again, there's that relational link again. Next is users. Pretty straightforward. There's some information we'll want to know about the user, first name, last name, maybe a suffix if that's required in your environment. The primary email address, because remember, your asset management tool has good workflow capability and the ability to send emails. Maybe you want to send an email out to the user and say, hey, do you still have all of these assets that are assigned to you? Well, if we don't have that email address, there's no way the system knows how to communicate with that person. Same thing with a phone number. Some systems will support text messaging. So you could actually send a text message out automatically from the system to do something to remind that user, hey, it's time to bring your asset in for a health check, or we're going to be replacing your asset next month. So those kinds of information is helpful when we have some contact information. The address, city, state, zip, country, of course, those are important if they're not generally not required, but they're really nice and meaningful as you want to get good value out of your data. The organizational unit, so here what we're saying is Todd, for example, is the user, and I report up into the sales department. And so again, it's that relational record that says, hey, Todd has to exist in the system before I can assign him as into the sales organization. And I got that backwards. The sales department has to exist in the system before Todd can have him be assigned to that organization. Title, job title. Again, some systems don't make the title a value that's managed in the system. I know, for example, the Avanti tool does. So you have to have all the job titles in the system before you can actually assign one. The manager, location. This one's very important here, the login ID. The login ID is the unique identifier that makes that record unique, because there might be 5 John Does in your company, but there's only each one of those John Does has a unique network login ID, and oftentimes the network login ID is kind of used as that unique key. And again, it's required to be in the system, and I should have put an X here because it's absolutely required. The hire date, this can be helpful when you're trying to figure out if someone has just come on board and you're trying to do some onboarding, or maybe a termination date so that you can do offboarding and know that, hey, I need to pull back those assets from that individual. And then lastly, as a team, some systems use, whenever this person is part of a support team, they're linked to a team for support purposes. So that's what the user information that we would try and gather. Next questions.
Sorry, Todd. So can we be using Workday or Active Directory to populate this information, or?
Absolutely. Active Directory is probably the most commonly used by customers to bring in this information automatically. So all of the users that are in Active Directory can be automatically populated into your asset management system. The same with Workday. Excellent sources for user information, because the HR team generally keeps that information accurate as individuals come and go in the company. Great question.
Question on other fixed assets. Do you find that most customers use a single asset management system for both the IT assets and the financial accounting assets, or do you see 2 different tools?
That's a great question. I think most frequently we see capital asset systems are different than IT asset systems. Some tools, I know Avanti as an example, provides a linkage code between an external capital asset system and the asset system, but generally they're 2 different systems, because capital assets tend to include things like forklifts and trucks and other major investments that are outside of the scope of IT. So generally you see them in 2 different systems, but integration certainly is possible. All right, now with that foundation set, we've got location information, we've got organizational information, and user information. With all of that in place, and with quality records coming in from, as we just said, Workday or Active Directory or PeopleSoft, now we're ready to bring in those foundational assets that we're going to bring in the environment. So let's take a look at some of the asset attributes. And again, I would strongly encourage you, as you begin to roll out your asset program, don't try and do every asset that's in your environment of every type. Start with the ones that have maybe some more meaning, like the laptops or desktops or servers, and then move into your mobile devices, move into your infrastructure, router, switches, hubs. Start where you can get your arms around a specific type and class of asset, deliver value out to your stakeholders for those types, and then move out to broader asset types, so that, over a period of 6 or 8 months, you eventually get all the assets in your environment. Sometimes if you try to get everything in up front, well, again, we tend to stall because the data maybe isn't accurate or something's not working. So be careful not to try and do everything all at once. Start with one, kind of eat the elephant one bite at a time. So when we look at an asset record, there are several things that are absolutely essential. Certainly, it's the asset name, and this is typically comes from Active Directory. It's the device name that's usually used in Active Directory. An asset tag, when you bring an asset into an environment, some organizations are not doing asset tagging, so technically most systems will work without a valid asset tag, but it's certainly one according to best practice you would want. And without a doubt, the single most important attribute that's used to link everything together is the serial number. So you need to make sure that when you bring in that make, model, part number, the asset name, there needs to be a serial number, because that serial number is what we link everything else with. When we want to bring in a purchase order information from the vendor, they provide an invoice that says, hey, here's three Dell Inspiron whatevers, and here's the individual serial numbers for each of those. When we import that data to get that purchasing information, we're going to link that against serial number. When you bring in your discovery data from EPM or SCCM or any of the other discovery tools out there, that linkage between the asset record and the discovery is all based on that serial number. So serial number is absolutely essential in the world of asset management. The asset type, different tools support different types of assets, but you'll need to make sure that you're mapped according to what the tool uses in terms of the asset type and subtypes. An example would that be, an example of a type would be computer. A subtype might be laptop, desktop, server, mobile client, virtual server, virtual desktop. Those are subtypes. And so as you think about organizing your data, when you're bringing in this new data, you want to design based on the capability of your asset tool, what are those classifications of the assets and how do you want them grouped? You certainly don't want, 10,000 assets all just jumped into one thing called computer, because that would be very, very unwieldy in terms of being able to get meaningful management reports. You want to break those computers down by subtypes, so you can see all your servers, you can see all your desktops, all your laptops, all your tablets, and that's what we call subtyping. A catalog item, you'll notice here that's something that we would say that will probably come in a later phase after you've got your foundation data in, but a catalog item is where you can say this particular asset came into my environment because it's associated with a particular standard or a catalog item in our system. Next would be manufacturer, and this is one of those that most tools require you to have a predefined list of manufacturers, so that when you bring that asset record in, you're not spelling it, Lenovo Inc., or let's do Microsoft's a great one. You're bringing in some software. Sometimes you'll see Microsoft as Microsoft Corp, Microsoft, spelt, with a corporation at the end versus CORP. And so you see all of these naming problems, and so that's a real challenge. You don't want to have those different versions of manufacturers, because when you run a report that says, hey, show me everything I've bought from Microsoft or Dell or Lenovo or HP, you want to make sure that all of them have the same manufacturer name. HP is a great example. A lot of people abbreviated HP. Other people spell it out as Hewlett-Packard. And so that's where most of your tools are going to require you to have what's called a normalized list of manufacturers before you bring those asset records in, so that you make positive that every asset that's of a given manufacturer, it's spelled the same, which is critical for your searching capability. You'll want to be able to capture the model number, and model numbers are there's so many different model numbers. Oftentimes it doesn't make sense to make them a normalized list, but it's very important because you're going to want to be able to run reports on the different models, and part numbers are also very helpful as you're looking through your inventory for a specific part number. Description fields are very helpful, because oftentimes when you bring in a specialized asset, you don't have enough information in the model number to know that this particular server has this much memory, these many hard drives, this many fault-tolerant features. So that's where your description becomes very valuable as you describe that asset, so that people that are coming into the system can say, oh yeah, that's the one I'm after. So try to make sure that you spend some time adequately describing those particular devices. And oftentimes you can pull that description right out of the procurement process, where the vendor has provided you a nice list of what that asset consists of. Color, weight, dimensions, things of that nature also can come directly from the catalog or from the vendor to be able to give you some more context about the asset. And the more data that these things that say nice on here, you can visualize in your mind that the more information you have about the asset, the more meaningful that your environment will be. But oftentimes, when you're first starting, you don't have the latitude to go get all of those nice little things. That's why we've kind of broken them out by required versus nice. Condition, well, this is helpful because you want to know whether it's a new device or used device. Helpful in reallocating those assets. The status is a very important field, and most systems have a fairly restricted list of what the life cycle states are. So, for example, an asset may be assigned or in stock or in repair. Those are things that the tool uses inherently to govern how that asset moves throughout its life cycle. We call them life cycle statuses. Environment, this is helpful if you're trying to understand, is this particular tool a secondary device? Is it in production? Is it a test server? Is it a dev server? Things of that nature. The use policy, service level, and sensitivity, each of these are areas where you can provide some context about how that asset's being used. So you can say this particular server has some HIPAA data on it or some PCI data. I want to be very careful with how we use this because there's a lot of confidential and risk associated with this device. So these are attributes that you define along with regulatory. All of these here are attributes that kind of define how that asset's being used in your environment. And what you'll find is that your security team is really going to want to work with you on defining those attributes because, as we talked in our last session, security is absolutely dependent upon asset management to know what hardware and what software is in my environment, where it's located, and who's using it. It's paramount to have that information so that you know, so that you can protect the environment from a security perspective. So these attributes here are very useful for you when you're working with your security team. The assigned user and the assigned location, certainly we talked about that. This is saying, hey, this device is being used by John, and it's located in the Bountiful office. And it's just foundational to knowing where the asset is. So very important, and that's why we went to that effort before in bringing in all of our users, our locations, so that we can link. And again, you'll notice here that I put the word nice in here because sometimes when you start out an asset management program, part of your problem is you don't know where those assets are. So if you have that data, it's nice to put it in originally, but what you're going to want to do is move from nice to required as you begin to build out your program so that you know every asset. If it's not assigned to a person, it better be assigned to an inventory location. No more of this assets that are just nowhere in no man's land. So that's where we're going to move from nice to required as we mature our environment. The reason I put purchase date and useful life as required, because the purchase date gives us a clue. If we can find something from any of our procurement information that says, hey, we bought this or we installed this device on this date, that gives us, most systems, the ability to calculate for you the age of the asset. And that's critical as you're trying to get your arms around how old are my assets, when do I need to refresh them, what does my estate look like. So that's why I set that as a required. Clearly, it would be if you don't have it, you don't have it. But it's really important that if you have access to the purchase date or the in-service date, any of those two fields, it will help you understand where you're at. Warranty information. Again, a lot of times you don't have this when you first start out, but you want to again move these ones here. Want to move towards that required space also as you mature your environment. Barcoding information, a lot of people will start out with some barcode capability to take that asset tag and be able to use a handheld scanner to go in and status the devices in your environment. And some will move towards RFID, which is a more advanced form of identification and management. and then there's other IDs like the SysID. Vendor information, we're at some point as we mature, you'll see now we're kind of into the purchasing management. As we begin to integrate with our purchasing systems, we're going to want to know the purchase order, the invoice number, the shipment number, the vendor SKU, freight cost, purchase price, those kinds of things. As we mature as we get past the foundation stage, we're going to go really work hard on that purchasing module to make sure that we're integrated fully with our purchasing system. And then we're down to the financial owner. This is that field we talked about where we're going to put in the cost center that says, hey, this asset is in sales, this asset is being consumed in engineering, and so forth. And then the last two here is the market price. Sometimes you have some tools will allow you to keep track of what the current value of that asset is, either through a depreciated value or some calculation that says, hey, the street price value of this, if you're in an M&A kind of environment, then you can come up with a purchase price. But that's very seldom you have that when you're first starting out. And then the last thing that's required is that if that asset is not allocated to an individual, but it's allocated to inventory, we better know the location where that inventory is stored. And so that, again, goes back to that location of knowing where we're at. So that's a really quick overview. There are hundreds of other attributes that are relevant to asset management. So remember, when you get this document, this kind of is just a focus on, this isn't the focus on everything. This kind of represents the whole world of asset management. But when you first start out, you're going to focus here on just that foundational package, those basic elements that will get you a rock-solid foundation so you can mature and grow. John, any questions?
Yeah, a question on discovery tools, whether it's Microsoft SCCM or I know many of the folks on the webinar today might have Ivanti Endpoint Manager, EPM. Can we use these tools to populate this data?
Yeah, it's a great question. And oftentimes, as I mentioned, you don't have good purchasing data. You don't have any, you don't know. That's why you're building a system, is because you don't have that previous history of where those assets came from. And all we do know is what we've discovered on the wire. And so that absolutely is a source that we can use to make this initial population of what's in our environment. So the answer is yes. And many times for older assets that are in the environment, that's all the customer has because they don't have good records about purchasing or other sources to tell them where the actual acquisition came from. Okay,
great. I did want to put your information back up here, so if you don't have anything else to share, hopefully you're seeing my screen now, and we've got Todd, we've got your email address on there as well. So if you have any questions for Todd, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, but if you have any questions after today's webinar, please feel free to email Todd. And the reason we were in that Word document format today was because this is the format that you use with our customers when you go out and consult, and we will be sending that to you as well. So I'll email it, and we'll also put it in the direct mailer that we send out to you along with those goggles that we're giving away. So that pretty much wraps it up. I don't see any more questions here. So Todd, thanks for this second part 2 in your webinar series here on ITAM. Part 3 is coming in August. Do you want to give us a little teaser on what's coming up next?
Yeah, we've talked about ITAM best practice. We've talked about why executives care. We've talked about what are those foundational data elements that you need to get started with. I think it would be nice the next time to take a look at what an asset management system looks like, what kind of value you can get when you put in this type of data. So we'll be providing a demonstration. I think we're going to use the Ivanti Asset Manager product as that demonstration to show you the value that you can get out of how you can solve those executive problems using that foundational data to drive value back into the enterprise. So that's what we're going to do, is show a little demo.
So Todd, again, thanks for joining us. I know you're busy with a lot of our current customers, consulting with them, so thanks for your time today. Any final thoughts?
We just hope this document will be helpful regardless of what tool you're using. If you'll just focus on good quality foundational data, you have a really good shot at being successful. So I hope this will be helpful to you in some way. Thanks, everybody. Have a great summer.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you in August on part 3 of this webinar series. Thank you, and have a great day.